Tennessee Williams and the Shadow of the Lost Cause. It's 2020. Words are ringing in our ears. Coronavirus, COVID, masks, social distancing, Black Lives Matter, white supremacists, lost cause, Confederate statues, racism, socialism, radicalism. It's almost fall 2020. And time for us all in Columbus to commemorate the dramatic and poetic art of Thomas Lanier Williams, known as Tennessee Williams, who died almost 40 years ago. We are experiencing a time of world health crisis due to a deadly virus. We are seeing worldwide focus on race relations. We are discussing how to guarantee personal freedom and practice social responsibility. Our time is a continuation of the conditions that produced the themes of Tennessee Williams' writing. As Tom Wingfield said of the 1930s in The Glass Menagerie, the huge middle class of America is matriculating in a school for the blind. Tennessee Williams was born in Columbus, Mississippi on March 26, 1911. He would become one of the most celebrated playwrights in the world. In a 15-year period from 1945, when World War II ended, to 1960, when the Civil Rights Movement was in high gear, his plays The Glass Menagerie, Streetcar Named Desire, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Night of the Iguana, and Sweet Bird of Youth won award after award. His birthplace is Columbus because his mother Edwina and his grandparents, who were all born in the Yankee land known as Ohio, moved to Columbus from Port Gibson, Mississippi in July of 1905. So Reverend Walter Edwin Dakin could become the priest in charge at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. Tennessee's father, Cornelius Coffin Williams, was in Columbus for a month in 1906 on assignment for the Cumberland Telephone and Telegraph Company. After her son was famous, a publisher asked Edwina in 1961 to write her autobiography because fans of her son's plays were curious about his personal background. With a co-writer, Lucy Freeman, Edwina spent parts of 1961 and 1962 dictating highlights of her life. She called her autobiography Remember Me to Tom because she never knew when her busy son would have time to visit her. Edwina emphasized that she was descended from Northerners, Quakers, the kind of people who were known to help runaway slaves and avoid serving in the military. Her father had told her that most of their colonial ancestors had run away to Canada when the American Revolution started, and she would have a hard time qualifying for the Daughters of the American Revolution. But she eventually did. She would certainly not qualify for membership in the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Edwina was born not far from Columbus, Ohio. Her parents moved to Tennessee when she was 5 because her mother's family, the Otts, moved south to the region near Chattanooga. Edwina started school about 1890, the same time Mississippi and other southern states drew up new laws to disenfranchise and restrict property ownership for African Americans. Edwina was coming of age in the era of Jim Crow segregation and white supremacist lost cause mentality. In the 1890s, her father decided to become an Episcopal priest. He studied for the priesthood at the University of the South at Sewanee, and his first church was in South Pittsburgh, Tennessee, where Edwina made lifelong friends with the children of the affluent Lodge family, founders of Lodge Cast Iron Company. Edwina's life would be shaped by an acceptance of her own family's poverty and simplicity when most of the people in her father's churches were relatively wealthy. After she finished school at age 18, her father moved to Mississippi churches, serving in Port Gibson and in Natchez before spending over 8 years in Columbus and finishing his career in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Edwina arrived in Columbus at age 21, unmarried, and with a love of singing, dancing, card games, going to the theater, and talking. She kept a notebook of her social activities in Columbus from her arrival in 1905 until her marriage almost 2 years later in June of 1907. She noted that her first days in Columbus were spent going on carriage or buggy rides with a young man who called his horse Ku Klux. He was Gaius Whitfield from Demopolis, Alabama, and he introduced her to the single men and women in their 20s who held dances regularly and played cards and called on each other on porches and in parlors. In the late summer of 1905, the young singles organized a Columbus group they called the Choctaw Club to plan regular dances. They went to the theater on Main Street and to concerts at the Women's College on College Street. Edwina planned a trip to Tuscaloosa to visit her Lodge family friends, but had to cancel due to a yellow fever outbreak. Governor Vardaman issued a travel ban, and the colleges all postponed their opening until November. In Remember Me to Tom, Edwina doesn't admit to any awareness of political conditions in 1905, but she probably knew that the national military parks were being built at Vicksburg and at Shiloh, Tennessee, with monuments commemorating Civil War battles and Union and Confederate dead and wounded and surviving veterans. She probably heard that in Columbus, Stephen D. Lee was a survivor of the Confederate defeat at Vicksburg, and that he went on to be the first president of Mississippi A&M and an important figure in the military reunions and the establishment of the military parks in the 1890s. By 1905, he was getting old and feeble, like most of the Confederate veterans. With 2 weekly newspapers in Columbus, she would have known that the white supremacist governor of Mississippi elected in 1903, James K. Vardaman, encouraged black people to leave the state to make room for German and Italian immigrants who would take jobs on farms and in factories. There was at least one mention in the local paper of an out-migration of black people going to Oklahoma about 1908. We have been reminded recently in 2020 of affluent blacks being massacred in Tulsa in 1921 after false rape accusations. Vardaman wanted lynching to be legal, and he wanted to stop spending on education for black people. He was one of the most influential white supremacists of his time, going from Mississippi governor to U.S. senator. His racist leadership was continued through World War II by the equally racist Theodore Bilbo, who was also elected governor of Mississippi and U.S. senator. In Edwina's first month in Columbus, a local paper published a supplement featuring industrial prosperity in Columbus. The process included the construction of a streetcar line and the proposal for a Confederate monument to be paid for by private donations and placed somewhere near the center of town. Fundraising for the monument was organized by the local chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, a national organization that began in 1894. 4 years after the founding of another society for women, the Daughters of the American Revolution, founded in 1890. The UDC wanted a monument featuring 4 statues of men from Columbus who had fought for the Confederacy. They needed to raise $10,000 and find a place to put the monument. One possible location being considered was a city block at the south end of Market Street, or 5th Street South, known as Bradford Square. At that time, Bradford Square was being used for band concerts and picnics, but it was privately owned. Eventually, it was sold for real estate development, and a post office was built on the corner. Eventually, the post office building became what it remains today, the Columbus Light and Water Department, and not a location for the Confederate monument. Meanwhile, as the UDC continued to raise money for their monument, Edwina attended every dance, played whist wherever she was invited, and was recognized at church and at the college as a gifted singer. In her first spring in Columbus, she was invited to be a featured performer at a variety show being planned by the UDC as a fundraiser for the Confederate monument. The date of the concert was May 8th, the same day that everyone in the African-American community of Columbus celebrated Emancipation Day with parades and festivities. At a concert rehearsal, Edwina met her future husband, Cornelius Coffin Williams, who was from Knoxville, Tennessee. Edwina sang, and Cornelius was charmed. They spent most of May seeing each other almost every day, until Cornelius was recalled by the phone company for a job in Memphis. Meanwhile, the UDC continued to plan fundraisers, and Edwina was asked to sing again, this time in July of 1906. in the newly established City Park Pavilion near the Luxapalila River at the east end of the New Columbus streetcar line. During the next year, Cornelius courted Edwina by phone and occasional weekend visits by train from his new workplace for the phone company in Gulfport. Edwina became a regular at the afternoon card parties of the wealthier women in town and sang in the church choir. In June of 1907, Cornelius arrived by train from Gulfport on a weekend and suddenly asked Edwina and her parents for permission to marry. This meant no wedding parties, no fancy church wedding, just a private church service conducted by Reverend Dakin, the bride's father. Then they got on the train to Gulfport. It was an awkward beginning for what was to be a difficult marriage that nonetheless produced 3 children. Cornelius and Edwina lived together in Gulfport for parts of the coming year, long enough for Edwina to become pregnant while making periodic trips to Columbus to stay with her parents in the church rectory and play whist with the other married ladies. By October of 1908, Edwina moved in with her parents in the St. Paul's Rectory for the birth of her first child, Rose. In November 19th, Rose was born. In the same month, women in Columbus held their first meeting of a chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Edwina was not a founding member. At about the same time, Cornelius's father died in Knoxville. Cornelius quit his job with the telephone company in Gulfport and moved by himself to Knoxville to be near his 2 sisters and find new work as a salesman. He perhaps expected a sizable inheritance after his father's death, but this did not happen. Cornelius and Edwina would not live together except on occasional visits for the next 10 years. After the birth of Rose, Edwina settled in as a member of her parents' household and as a fixture in the social life of married women in the town. She was listed in the local paper as a participant in the Married Ladies Whist Club and the Wednesday Whist Club. She also became a member of the DAR after finding a Quaker ancestor who briefly saw military action during the American Revolution. In March of 1911, Tom was born. In August of 1912, the UDC placed their Confederate monument next to the Lowndes County Courthouse. In 1913, Edwina was elected an officer of the local DAR, but her father was getting regular invitations from churches to leave Columbus. Edwina had settled in as a nearly 30-year-old mother of 2 and did not want to leave the only community she had been part of in her adult life. She tried to persuade Cornelius to move to Columbus, but it wasn't going to happen. She would leave Columbus in 1914 and live with her parents for 4 more years in Episcopal rectories in Nashville, Canton, Mississippi, and Clarksdale. 11 years after their marriage, Edwina's husband found a job in St. Louis at the International Shoe Company and told Edwina to bring Rose and Tom to St. Louis to be with him. Edwina emphasized 2 things about her son's early years in Remember Me to Tom. One is that he almost died of diphtheria and was temporarily crippled by a kidney condition called Bright's disease. She credits herself with saving his life during their time in Canton or Clarksdale. The timeline is unclear. The other point of emphasis is that her children were cared for in Columbus and in Clarksdale and Nashville and Canton by a wonderful young black woman she identifies only as Ozzie, short for Ozella, I presume. Edwina claims that her son learned to respect African Americans and disdain the bullying and white supremacy of his environment because of his love and appreciation for Ozzie. In 1918, Edwina and Tom and Rose began living in rental housing in St. Louis as the Spanish flu epidemic was spreading around the globe. The Williams family survived and added another son, Dakin. Tom would go on to be bullied as a child because of his physical weakness, but he would learn to earn respect for his intelligence and his talent as a writer while he was a teen in St. Louis, before going on to the University of Missouri, Washington University in St. Louis, and the University of Iowa. Much of Remember Me to Tom is a description of the verbal abuse and bullying inflicted by Cornelius on his wife and children. In 1939, Tom left his family for good, starting with a stay in New Orleans and traveling to California to support himself with odd jobs. Like many other people in the Great Depression, Hitler and the Nazis were threatening to take over the world. When Tom's writing attracted the attention of theater people in New York, he started writing a play about lynching and racist white hypocrites in a small southern town like Clarksdale. The main character would be a Christ figure killed or crucified by ordinary people who didn't tolerate departures from their norms of behavior. The play was called Battle of Angels, and it was a financial failure, but it set Tennessee Williams on a path to writing about the perpetrators and the victims of meanness and cruelty for the rest of his life. In 1961, when Edwina was nearing 80, her son Tom was 50 years old. Edwina was known throughout the world as the model for Amanda Wingfield, the mother in The Glass Menagerie. By then, her father and her husband had both died. Edwina didn't have to worry about what they thought of her version of history. They were not around to fact-check what she said in Remember Me to Tom. She had been living in St. Louis for over 40 years and never once went back to visit Columbus, Mississippi. Times had changed since she'd been a single woman in Columbus, Mississippi, helping the United Daughters of the Confederacy raise money for a lost cause monument. In 1955, Emmett Till had been murdered, his murderers acquitted. His lynching made Mississippi a symbol of the racist Jim Crow social order that had been building ever since the Civil War. In the same year, Rosa Parks became a model of quiet protest. In 1961, the Freedom Riders headed for Alabama and Mississippi to call for voting rights and full participation of African Americans in the political, social, and economic systems of life in the United States. John F. Kennedy was the president, inclined to side with people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. Edwina needed to tell the story of her life and her sons in the context of the 1960s. There would be no mention of the United Daughters of the Confederacy or Confederate monuments in Columbus in Remember Me to Tom. Instead, Edwina began her book by emphasizing the importance of a young black woman in their lives, the woman known to us only as Ozzie, who had lived with the family for about 6 years as they moved from Columbus to Nashville to Canton and to Clarksdale. She was to be the image of friendship and kindness that Tom and his sister Rose would carry with them for life.